as you're looking to what to protect, that's what I would look for, things that are either in bloom currently, which, you know, it's supposed to get pretty low, I think. So that may be a struggle, or about to bloom. And I wish you all good luck with that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen again for this berry information. And we'll get some resources posted on the website following this program along with the recording. I do real quick want to mention, this is mentioned, I mentioned this as part of the presentation. This is the Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide. And if you're going to buy one item, this is what I would buy. It's nice, comprehensive extension publication that was developed specifically for the Midwest. And we'll get that information out there. It used to be available on the web for free. I don't think it is anymore. Okay, let me get my screen back up and we'll get going. Okay. As you already know, this is all our Area 5 crew. So what we're going to cover today, oops, I'm going to turn off my camera like I said, are strawberries, brambles, which include raspberries and blackberries, and then blueberries. So we're going to cover quite a bit of information, and I'm going to go relatively fast. But like I said, we'll provide you with some good resources that will help you along the way. So another thing that I'd like to point out, if you do a Google search of Horticulture Extension Purdue, this is the page that will actually come up. And you can see here where my cursor is, the fruit crops link, and that will have a number of resources for you. One resource that you might want to sign up for is the Facts for Fancy Fruit newsletter, which would be emailed to you, and it covers timely fruit-related topics. It's somewhat directed towards more commercial growers, but still a really good resource for home growers. So you might definitely check that out. Currently, our small fruit and grape specialist position is actually vacant. Dr. Bruce Bordelon retired at the end of December. So there isn't somebody on campus necessarily dedicated to this right at this moment. But all your county educators are happy to help you with berry related questions as you move forward. Here again is that resource I mentioned, the Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide. This is a free publication from Purdue that's more focused on fruit tree growing, but it does have some small fruit information in the back. This high bush blueberry production guide is available from the University of Kentucky. And these three up here are actually sort of more targeted towards commercial growers, but still good references if you're interested. So like I said, those will be available on the website. As Kurt mentioned, you know, fruit crops, they are very rewarding because the fruit produced out of your home garden, it's just like our homegrown tomatoes. It tastes so much better than anything you could buy at the grocery store. And there's nothing like going out to the strawberry patch with your kids and just, you know, picking and eating right there as you're standing in the garden. They taste so good, but they are not necessarily going to be without effort. They actually require quite a bit of input in order to be successful with them. And they also require some time. Not as long as fruit trees. Berry crops don't take as long as fruit trees, but they still do require time to full production. And you can see here, for example, the strawberries, it typically takes 1 year until you can get full production. So that space will be occupied in your garden for a year without really any production, 2 to 3 years for brambles, and then 3+ years for blueberries. You might get some production those first couple years, but it's definitely not going to be significant and not going to reach its peak production for the first couple years. And then diseases and insects are another issue. With the berries, it's more of an insect issue than disease often, but there are also some diseases that can present some problems. So knowing what you can utilize to treat those insects and diseases, and then being able to apply them at the appropriate times. So if you're gonna, I should mention this presentation was developed by Bruce Bordelon, and he, and I've adapted it here for our program today, and he listed out the sort of the rate of difficulty of gardening with strawberries, brambles, grapes, etc., as you can see here. And in my own personal experience, I would actually flip the difficult and moderate. I would agree strawberry and brambles are relatively easy, and you get pretty decent production without a lot of space. And then I'd put blueberries in the moderate category. I've had pretty good success with blueberries without a terrible amount of difficulty. Fruit trees, in my opinion, take more management, and time is one thing that I'm definitely limited by. So they get the leftovers of my time and are not managed probably as they should be. Blueberries have some very specific soil requirements that do make them somewhat of a challenge. And with all these things, critters can get your fruit before you actually do. So we have people I know from all over the place watching. It's important to keep in mind, some issues with cold hardiness as you're talking about what kind of crops you're going to select. With your home garden, you don't usually have a whole lot of choice with site selection, but you definitely want to avoid cold air sinks. You know, my berries are up on a ridge. I do have this little low spot that I could have planted a garden, but it definitely, the cold air hits there longer and harder, and would likely have more frost impact than where I have my garden located not now. With your soil selection, you know, good drainage, hopefully high organic matter if possible. And that's one thing as a gardener you can continue to do is add organic matter. A lot of our fruits can tolerate our heavier clay soils that we are so blessed with in southern Indiana. I don't have great soil in my garden. It's definitely improved over the years, but still quite a bit of big clay component, and I have good production with my berries. Cold hardiness is really an issue with blackberries more than anything. The Primocane fruiting type is what that PF stands for, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So Primocane fruiting varieties, which means they produce fruit on the canes the first year, can be grown, blackberries can be grown in the north. Your Floricane fruiting varieties need to be grown in the south because they're susceptible to cold temperatures. But strawberries and blueberries can be grown throughout the state. Raspberries can definitely be grown in southern Indiana, but they can suffer a little bit from heat and drought stress. So our really hot southern Indiana summers can be a little stressful on raspberries. But if you can put them in a little microclimate, maybe where their exposure is less, they can definitely do very well. Okay, so moving on specifically to strawberries. There are a number of different types of production systems. We're going to talk about matted row as one that people commonly use in their garden settings. We'll talk a little bit about raised beds. I'll briefly mention plasticulture, and then I'll also talk about containers. So one thing to keep in mind with strawberries, if you look in a fruit catalog, you will see June bearers listed probably in a separate section than day neutrals, or what they now call ever bearers. June bearers, there's a lot more varieties, and they do very well in the Midwest. They are named June bearers basically because much of the production becomes ripe in June. And they, in contrast to the day neutrals or ever bearers, basically set all their flowers and therefore their fruit at one time, where the day neutrals, and they do that based on period of daylight. So in contrast to the day neutrals, which are not dependent on daylight for when they set their flowers and fruit. And the day neutrals, because they're not dependent on that, do produce throughout the growing season. I have much more experience growing June bearers than I do with the day neutrals, but both can be successful, and you can produce wonderful, tasty fruit. Another thing to keep in mind about strawberries is, people think of them as a perennial crop, and you will get production for several years in a row, but they do have some issues with soil-borne diseases, which may limit production to 3 to 4 years. And it's also important to manage them well for good production, and we'll talk about that. As I already mentioned, they're relatively quick to produce. Their production can be relatively limited to 3 to 4 years, but you can be rotating that next section of your garden in to make up whenever another section goes out. We tend to mulch them for winter protection, and then they may need frost protection. We'll talk about row covers, which is the easiest and most readily available for homeowners. And I'll mention overhead irrigation, which some commercial growers utilize. Very difficult for home growers to successfully utilize that, but it's mentioned sometimes, and so I want to give an explanation of it. Common problems associated with strawberries include weed problems, fruit rots, gray mold, also known as botrytis. It's very common. Slugs are also very common. Some beetles are also frequent. They'll get your fruit before you do. And then this black rot root complex is an issue, as I mentioned, that develops in the soil over time. Once strawberries are cultivated in the same place for several years. Strawberries are relatively cheap to buy. You can get a relatively large strawberry patch with relatively low financial input. This is a picture of a matted row system. And you can see, great numbers of strawberry blooms on the plants there, and then the straw between the rows, and that's why it's called the matted row system. And this, as I mentioned, is the most common way of growing strawberries in the Midwest. It's nice because it's easily accessible. You can get in and pick, and once strawberries are in production, you need to pick frequently, or you will get those insect and critter issues, and you're more likely to have fungal problems as well. So when you buy strawberries, you buy them in crowns like this package you see over here. They're dormant crowns. You plant them in year 1, and here this diagram shows you the proper planting method, and this diagram is from that Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide. And you want to plant them so the crown is just at soil level, as you see here on example A. They can be planted too deep and or too shallow, both of which will stress the plant and limit production. or they can be planted as a sort of J-rooted situation where the roots are bent, and again, the plant just won't be as vigorous and you won't get the production that you hope for. In that first year, you get them planted, and you actually want to remove the flowers. You want the strawberry to send its energy into becoming established rather than fruit production. So you will get some flower production that first year, but we recommend going ahead and removing those flowers and preventing the fruit production, because like I just said, you know, energy into the root system. Typically, you set the plants 18 to 24 inches apart, and the rows are, we'll say, 3 to 4 feet apart. And keeping rows towards the wide side is helpful for operating. I try to cram too much into my garden and end up with my rows too close together. And it does, you know, the strawberry plants do get bushy, and it gets hard to get in there and maneuver around them during the growing season. That first year, any runners that you see, you want to move from in between the rows into the rows, as they've done here. You can see the runners sort of filling in here. As those root, they will form new plants, and you'll get new production from those runners. So, you want good irrigation, good regular watering for good production, and then weed management. The mulch, the straw, the matted row can help with weed management. You want to get those runners set, so watering the whole row so that you get encouraged. Good production is important. Like I said, you'll get those multiple crowns and good fruit clusters for the coming year. We recommend, you probably heard this already in the gardening series, about 1 inch of water per week, either by rainfall or irrigation. Late summer, August or September, is when they're actually working on setting their fruit buds. So you might consider applying a low rate application of a balanced fertilizer just to help them through that. Once you've got them established and they've gone through that first growing season, this is a pretty well established bed, as you can see here in this picture. You want to mulch the plants after they go dormant. It helps protect them from extreme winter temperatures. And generally, we would say that this would happen in December. Usually after 3 consecutive nights in the low 20s is when you would want to get the mulch on them. A lot of times many leaves will remain green, but sometimes they'll have a reddish cast to them when they go dormant. And you want to put about 4 inches of mulch on the top of them to help protect them through the winter time. And then make sure you use good clean mulch or straw mulch. You don't want any weed seed or anything that's just gonna create problems for you down the road. So look for good clean straw. Straw really is the best mulch for these guys. Leaves and grass clippings get too matted and can cause the crowns to rot. The straw provides good airflow, even while it is providing protection. So as we move into the start of the summer year, once soil temperatures reach above 40 degrees, you would want to remove the straw, and you'd rake it off the top of the crowns, the majority of it off the top of the crowns and into the row where you get the matted row, as the name implies. Leaving some straw will help keep your fruit clean as you move into the growing and picking season. So you don't want to leave too much because you do want the new leaves to be able to grow through there. But leaving a little bit does provide a nice little barrier between the soil and your fruit, and can also lessen the likelihood of soil-borne pathogens impacting fruit. So as you can see here, this slide just shows you some new leaves growing up through the straw. So it's a pretty light layer there that you're leaving for things to grow through. So once you get into, you know, late April, early May, into May, you get good leaf growth and the flower buds will start showing in the crowns. And they're real pretty in the garden as well. And you can see the blooms here. Blooms tend to last around 3 weeks. You can get pretty lengthy production of strawberries if you space your varieties out a little bit. And those, you know, you can get an early fruiting variety of June bearers, a late fruiting variety, a mid-season fruiting variety, and stretch the growing season quite a distance just based on variety. Then you can also incorporate the day neutrals into there, so you could have strawberries throughout the growing season. So these are good, healthy plants. You can see the fruit developing there as well. Fruit will be ready to harvest about 30 days after the petals fall. So, you know, if you're trying to plan around things, that's something to keep in mind. Strawberries are self-fruitful, meaning they don't need cross-pollination from another variety. You can get away with only planting one variety if that's all you're interested in and that's all you have space for. It's not like fruit trees and even blueberries that we'll talk about that can benefit from cross-pollination. Strawberries are pollinated by bees and by wind, and good pollination is important for good fruit development. Poor pollination can lead to misformed fruit, not fully formed fruit. It can happen when the bees aren't particularly active due to cold during the bloom time. Another thing that can happen during the bloom time, and it does happen with some frequency for sure. Definitely happened last year when we had that hard frost on May 10th, took out a lot of our strawberry production, although we were still able to get some fruit, but definitely not the almost overwhelming amount of fruit that we've had some years in past. So when you do get frost warnings and your plants are in flower, they do need some type of protection. And usually, you know, when they say the low is going to be around 28 degrees, that's about, or they're going to say it's going to be about 32 degrees. That's like a head height reading. So it's typically a little colder at the ground level. So you should plan for frost when those temperatures even get close. And as you can see in the picture here, the black flowers have been frost damaged. Basically all the pistils on the flowers there are damaged, and you will not get fruit production out of these two flowers. It does look like it's not impacted this flower, so you would get a strawberry here as well as a strawberry over there. With strawberries, there are primary, secondary, tertiary blooms. The primary blooms are earlier in the season, and they typically produce larger fruit. As the blooms come out later in the season, they're the secondary and tertiary blooms, and you typically get smaller fruit from that variety as you move into the later developing fruit. Here you can see fruit that was damaged due to frost. The temperatures just got low enough that the fruit was damaged. Here you can see poor fruit shape, which has occurred due to frost damage. So normally, you know, fruit develops around a seed. In strawberries, the fruit develops, you you know, with the seed on the outside. And each of those seeds, as they're pollinated and fertilized, they start producing hormones which encourage fruit growth. So if for some reason, you know, these flowers were damaged due to frost, they won't become fertilized. They won't begin producing the hormones that causes the fruit to be developed. So this is a picture of a row cover. In this case, it's a giant row cover. This is made from spun polyester material, which allows light and water to pass through, but does offer some frost protection and can provide insect protection for other types of crops. Of course, we want insect access to the berries for pollination. You should look for this kind of stuff. You can order it row cover online. You can also order it or find it in the big box stores. It's becoming definitely more common. Look for their frost protection rating. If you buy the kind that's just for insect protection, it's a lighter material and you're not going to get the thermal protection that you need for early season crops like this. So I mentioned that I wanted to bring up overhead irrigation because you will sometimes hear that being utilized as a way to prevent frost damage to fruit crops. I mentioned that it is really something only commercial growers utilize, and they utilize these low output sprinkler systems that are able to provide a continuous layer of actually ice on the plants because water freezes at 32 degrees and other things freeze at 30 degrees. That ice layer actually protects the plants. And, you know, crazy thermodynamics, as water freezes, heat is actually released and helps maintain the bud temperatures so that the fruit is protected. I have never heard of a homeowner successfully doing this because it does need a continuous layer of ice, and it typically requires pretty fine irrigation system that's able to emit very fine droplets. So not something that's typically available to us. I'm sure there are homeowner backyard growers who have utilized it, but I'm not aware of any, and it's not something we would generally recommend. Row covers are much more accessible and easy for homeowners to use. So, you know, once you've taken them through that season, you've hopefully avoided the frost, your fruit will mature, and it really is just a wonderful crop to grow. Like I said, best tasting stuff. I'm a tomato fan, but I love fresh strawberries better than tomatoes. So, but once that harvest is done, you're not finished in caring with your for your strawberries. With this matted row system, renovation of the strawberry bed is important for continued production into future years. Your goal with renovation is to create a new crop of crowns from runners, and those new crop crowns will be what produces your fruit in future years. So as soon as you're done harvesting, what we do is set our mower on the highest, our push mower on the highest setting it can go, as far as inches off the ground, and mow over the top of the row. You do want to avoid mowing too low, because if you mow into the crown, you will damage the plants. They won't produce new runners and new crowns, and you can also make them more susceptible to disease. And then you could till between rows. You don't want to till deeply, but tilling just the top level of surface can help break up. Well, it can help incorporate last year's straw, and it can also help incorporate other plant debris that you've just mown off, which will in the end add organic matter to your soil. You'll want to water, and then, as I mentioned, potentially fertilize late in the summer as the strawberries are setting fruit. Keeping rows narrow helps you operate in the system. Here you can see the renovation going on with the lawnmower, and here you can see the finished system. It's not real pretty, but it is effective, and mowing them off does stimulate that new runner growth that you need for good strawberry production the following years. And then here's a picture of the strawberry row after it's been renovated, and after also the space in between the rows has been narrowed down with the tiller. So as you're going throughout the growing season, you want to try and control weeds in here as much as possible, whether that's by putting down new mulch or cultivating or whatever the case may be. So you would try and put a little bit of new soil on the crowns as they develop, just to help them get reestablished. If you skip this step, typically your plants will be fine, but it's something that you can do to help encourage new root growth. Again, as I mentioned, with that first year, you'll want to sweep any runners that develop out of this area and limit the production to in the row. You want to make sure they get adequate water, and then I already mentioned the fertilization. So there's sort of what the finished product looks like. In raised beds, people like to grow things in raised beds, and you know, you can get pretty good strawberry production out of raised beds. There's no reason that you can't grow them in raised beds, but just remember they do still need to be renovated as well. So people will think that they can just leave them be, but in this case, this was not renovated. So there's very little fruit production due to plant competition because they're so packed in there. So they're not as vigorous as they would be if they were spaced out better. And what fruit is there is likely to be small and not particularly, you know, attractive fruit. The incidence of fruit rots is higher because there's poor airflow in there and things aren't able to dry out. So in order to improve production, you would want to do the renovation on your raised bed, remove most of the runners, thin it pretty heavily, leaving only a few in a row to develop so that you do get adequate fruit production. A few words about containers. They are especially good with the day neutral varieties. They produce most of their fruit in the spring. They're a little heavier production then, but they will continue to flower during the summer and fall, producing small crops of berries throughout the season. Heat can be an issue later in the summer. It can impact fruit set and also fruit quality. It would need to be picked very quickly. They can be started if you want production the first year. You can start day neutrals that first year, and you can allow them to go ahead and flower and produce fruit. So you wouldn't be removing those flowers that first year. All types of containers can be useful for growing these day neutral varieties. You know, we've got some in a pallet here. Planting into pallets was quite a rage here for a while. This is what they call a strawberry pot. And then here is a newer container that could be useful. People often ask about overwintering these plants, and it can be possible. You know, if you have the right kind of space, they're unlikely to survive outside in containers, especially just because their exposure is higher than if they're in the soil. But if you have the space to give them some protection or can provide a microclimate where maybe their exposure during the winter is not so much. They can be overwintered in the containers. So this is an example of plasticulture. Here you can see that they're growing on plastic, drip irrigation. And here they're also growing under tunnels. So on plastic and under low tunnels, in this case made of plastic. This provides sort of a greenhouse effect and allows them to develop earlier. High tunnel production of strawberries is also something that's increasing in Indiana. So, you know, I have friends growing in southern Indiana that are very close to a ripened strawberry crop right now. So because they are growing in high tunnels, which are just large unheated greenhouses. They rely on the sun for heat. Here's a good list of strawberry varieties that have been successful in Indiana. There's lots of other varieties out there. Choose those that have shown to be successful in the Midwest. Sometimes you'll see things that are, you know, developed for the Southwest or developed for the Pacific Northwest. Look for Midwest varieties. Yeah, so the day neutral varieties, another thing to note about them is that they don't particularly runner well. So producing future crops is a little less successful with them. Somebody, Mr. Williams types in the chat about weed control, and he said he didn't hear much about it, and it's true. I didn't mention it a whole lot. Chemicals are expensive, and very few would be labeled for use in a strawberry crop anyway. We generally don't recommend utilizing herbicides in vegetable crops or fruit crops unless you're working on a commercial scale. But, and he says 80% of his straw blew around the neighborhood, which is, it can be an issue. You could potentially plant a cover crop in there that might be winter killed. So it would form a matted area into the next spring. Other types of mulch can also work. Utilizing a stale seed bed kind of method where you till the soil a little bit, allow the weed seed to germinate, just barely germinate, and then going in and very lightly cultivating that area so that you don't turn over more soil and turn up more weed seed can be an effective way to control weeds. With that, I'm going to move on from strawberries. If folks have questions about strawberries, I'm going too long, as is a frequent problem of mine. I will try to address them at the end, or we can do a written Q&A that we can post to the website. On to brambles. So we're talking about blackberries, black raspberries, raspberries. They come into production in 2 to 3 years and can be relatively trouble-free. Oh, now my computer's locked up. Okay, there we go. I mentioned earlier, there are some varieties out there that are known as Floricane varieties or Primocane fruiting varieties. So the FF stands for Floricane fruiting. PF stands for Primocane fruiting. So Primocane are the canes that come up the first year that you plant a bramble. So Primocane fruiting can produce fruit the first year, or in subsequent years, they produce fruit on first year canes. Floricane fruiting varieties produce fruit on second year canes. So you plant them the first year, they grow, they don't necessarily produce fruit. They survive over winter, produce flowers and fruit the second year. So we've got a list of raspberries out there. You'll see red raspberries, gold, which are actually mutants of red, purple raspberries, and black raspberries, which produce in the summer. And then there are new Primocane fruiting varieties as well. And like with strawberries, you know, maturity times vary with different varieties. So you can have, if you grow several varieties of brambles, you can have, you know, different maturity times. So extending your season of fruit that way. In blackberries, the options are thorny and thornless, erect and semi-trailing, and then there are also some new Primocane fruiting varieties as well. With erect and semi-trailing, they do require a good bit of management because they will spread. Here's a picture of a red Floricane fruiting variety. And some Primocane fruit varieties of red raspberries and blackberries. Let me see where I am here. So the Floricane fruiting varieties used to be sort of the standard, and you get the 2-year production type. More and more Primocane fruiting varieties have been developed. You do need to track and keep in your memory or your garden journal or something what kind of variety you're dealing with, whether it's a Floricane fruiting variety or a Primocane fruiting variety, because you may end up pruning off your fruit if you don't know. Primocane fruiting varieties exist for red raspberries and black raspberries, those are relatively new, and also for blackberries. Again, the advantage is they produce fruit in that first growing season. Flowering, you want to prep the soil well and get them well established. Fruit production will actually start when the cane gets to about 20 nodes or 20 spots where leaves can come off. From there on through the fall, flower buds will form, but they do not have a dormancy requirement. So they will develop fruit and flowers. Sorry, I'm hopping around here. And then the older part of the Primocane overwinters and then produces the fruiting Floricane next year. So the vocabulary is a little hard to keep track of with Primocane and Floricane, but no matter what variety you choose, whether they are a Primocane fruiting or a Floricane fruiting, you know, they can produce good, successful fruit crop. It just might impact your management a little bit. Here's some summer cropping Primocane Red Raspberries. Any tips that would have died over the winter, you'd want to go through and remove those so that one, they can be a harborage for plant pathogens, but also to stimulate new growth. And then here's a Floricane fruiting variety of black raspberry. So in this case, when the Floricane, so they're the second year canes, produce the fruit, that cane is basically going to be dead after that growing season. And you will see those spent Floricanes as you're doing your garden cleanup in the winter, and you would want to remove those spent Floricanes. They're pretty unstable. They're easy to tell just by looking. I should have a good picture in here, but I don't. And they're easy to tell which ones should be removed. And that's just a good garden sanitation practice to help lessen the likelihood that fungal spores and other pathogens might overwinter on those Floricanes. Thornless varieties of blackberries are very popular. You know, when I used to pick blackberries as a kid, you'd have to battle the thorns and you'd usually end up scarred up from all over your arms from trying to pick. So that, you know, these thornless varieties offer that big advantage, but they're only moderately cold hardy. So if you're trying to grow thornless blackberries in northern Indiana, it's going to be a struggle. Berries are large and they have excellent flavor. There's several different types of varieties that have been produced through the University of Arkansas, and they're named after various Indian tribes. Most of them are erect, so that means they can grow without having a trellis, which is less work for you. There are also some eastern thornless cultivars, such as Triple Crown and Chester, which are highly vigorous, but they're only semi-erect. So they do require trellising due to their sprawling ground habit, because once that cane lands on the ground, it will root and start a new plant. So if you don't keep up with that and allow that, those plants to hit the ground and start new plants, you get a thicket of blackberry that's difficult to navigate through. So keep that in mind. If you do choose to grow the semi-erect varieties or trailing varieties, then you will need to trellis them, and you'll also need to keep track of them throughout the growing season and do some pruning. So basic care, you know, depending on the type of variety you're growing, you can get fruit on that first year. If it's a Primocane fruiting variety, if it's more of a traditional variety, the Floricane fruiting, you will get just vegetative growth the first year, and then you will get reproductive growth or fruit and flowers the second year on that Floricane. They do have shallow root systems, so making sure they're in a place where you can get them adequate water is important. I mentioned earlier the raspberries can be even a little more delicate than the other brambles, susceptible to hot winds and high temperatures. So placing them in an area where they might get a little more shelter from wind, or maybe get some shade later in the day or something like that, can help you be more successful with them. They have a very short shelf life. Even homegrown berries do. I mean, I'm sure we've all bought berries from either the farmer's market or the grocery store and had them, you know, practically rot in our refrigerator before we've had time to get to them. And even at home, the shelf life is pretty short. So if you're going to have a big crop of raspberries or black raspberries or blackberries, make sure that you're picking frequently and that you have a plan to utilize them, whether that's freezing them or whatever the case may be. Remember that trellising may be required, especially for those semi-erect varieties. It can help with other varieties, just trying to sort of delineate things and keeping things tidy, but those semi-erect varieties, as I mentioned, will reroot and grow and cause you troubles. The biggest problems that we find with brambles are cold injury, fungal disease known as anthracnose. There are bugs such as Japanese beetles and stink bugs that enjoy the berries as much as we do. And then there's a fruit fly that's known as spotted wing Drosophila that can also be a problem. So that Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide has information on managing those things. Here's some example of some trellises that you can utilize. You know, you can make trellises from lots of different things. Here we've got some rebar. If you're only doing a Primocane variety of black raspberry, You might want a trellis that you can mow down or remove so that you can mow down the leftover canes for a Primocane fruiting variety. After the growing season, you'll want to remove the splint floricanes, as I already mentioned. They're pretty easy to identify. You want to deadhead any dead tissue and just clean up on any Primocane fruiting varieties. You will still get spent canes in there, so they should be removed. You want to thin the canes out, just like the raised bed of the strawberries. You get too crowded and you get lower production. And then just shorten canes up if they're getting too long and lengthy. Tipping black raspberries also helps with production. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm really running out of time. Here you have a blackberry and black raspberry plant that has not been tipped. This is what it looks like after it's been tipped. And you can see the spent removed tissue here. Here is what happens. You get increased branching and therefore increased flower and fruit production when you tip. So that's something to keep in mind to help you get good production. You'll get more crop borne on these lateral shoots than the other ones. And then this just talks through some of what I already mentioned, removing the spent floricanes, trellising. This is what happens if you don't do if you don't keep those erect, if you don't keep those semi-erect and trailing things trimmed back, they'll hit the ground and start making new plants. Okay, I am going to quickly go through blueberries. I'm sorry, I'm skipping so much here. But that winter Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide goes through it quite thoroughly. With blueberries, oh, let me quickly say, here are the Bramble varieties, and those are mentioned. I mentioned the Arkansas developed varieties that are named after Indian tribes, and you can see more of them here. And then some red raspberries. We do have a commercial company. There's lots of commercial suppliers, but Indiana Berry is one berry company in Indiana. And even if you don't choose to order from them, their catalog has a lot of information on varieties. Don't want to seem to endorse one company over another because we're encouraged not to do that, but their catalog is helpful as an information source. So you might just get their catalog and check out the information that they provide. For blueberries, there's several different types, high bush, low bush. We generally grow high bush in Indiana. They're a long-lived woody shrub. They have shallow roots and lack root hairs, so their uptake of water can be a challenge. They're susceptible to drought. They do require acidic soils, high in organic matter to produce well and survive even. They do best if they're cross-pollinated, so you'll want to look for a suitable variety. They do have great fall color, so they can be nicely incorporated into your landscape if you can provide the other elements that they need to grow. You can see the flower buds there. They set their flower buds in late summer due to the shortening days. The high bush varieties are very cold hardy, grown way into the north. They do have small blooms, typically pollinated a lot by bumblebees. They bloom relatively early. Cross-pollination increases the vigor and amount of fruit produced. So this is a shot of one with good pollination, and this is a shot of a branch with poor pollination. So beyond the insects, having a different variety that is flowering at the same time will result in better fruit production. So when you're selecting your varieties, look and see whether they flower early, mid, or late, and make sure that you choose a variety that can cross-pollinate with the other varieties that you have present. And that guide from Kentucky is helpful when it comes to this. If your pH is not low enough, this will be the result. You will have iron deficiency. It's difficult to adjust soil pH over a large area for a certain or for any length of time. To have the best success as a home blueberry grower, what I have done and what our retired small fruit specialist recommended was basically digging a pit. It doesn't have to be terribly deep because, as we already mentioned, they're shallow rooted. But digging a pit, removing the clay or whatever native soil you may have that is higher in pH, and replacing it with a mix of peat, sand, and a good topsoil. And then you may actually have to apply sulfur every year to lower the pH, even if you do that. In my own blueberries, I do have to apply sulfur every year to lower the pH. And if I do not, I will end up with these chlorotic symptoms on the plants. Irrigation is important. I mentioned they're drought susceptible because they are so shallow rooted. The management of them is pretty easy. Mulching is a good idea just to reduce a little bit of the weed competition. Blueberries, as far as pruning them goes, the canes are most productive between 3 and 5 years of age. So older canes should be removed because they have low vigor and productivity. So each year after you've got a 5-year-old bush, removing the oldest canes can help increase that production. And that's called renewal pruning. So here's one before and here's one after with those older canes removed. The biggest problem with blueberries is that often the birds will get them before you do. And just draping the bird netting over the crop really doesn't work because the birds can eat through the bird netting. You need to set up some kind of system where you can hold the bird netting off the plants, off the shrubs for it to be effective. Here's some varieties that can be utilized in Indiana, many others. As I mentioned, look for those varieties that will cross-pollinate because they flower early or maybe mid or late. Make sure you choose at least 2 of an early flowering variety, a mid flowering variety, and a late flowering variety. And, again, like we talked about with the brambles and strawberries, you can stretch out the season. This photo, just FYI, shows you both good and bad pollination. So maybe those early flowers, the weather was nice, and these later flowers, the cold and rainy, so the insects didn't pollinate as well. So I have wrapped up here. I know it was fast and furious with the information, but we will get you some good resources to follow up on. If folks want to stay on, if they have questions, I'm happy to stay on, but I have used up all the time. We've hit 1 p.m. I thank you for your time and attention, and we'll see you next week.
Linda put a question in the box for you there.
Okay.
She's inherited a established blackberry or black raspberry patch, and she's wanting to know how she can determine what she has exactly. Floricanes or Primocanes or what she's looking at.
So more than likely, I would lean toward second-year fruiting or Floricane production, just because if you inherited it, those newer Primocane fruiting varieties are relatively recently developed. You could also just watch for flowers and fruiting. For example, if the cold doesn't get them this year, You know, do you see flower and fruit production on canes that grew this year, or are you seeing it on canes that grew last year? Sometimes it's like hydrangea pruning too. You just have to watch for a couple seasons to really know what's going on. There's no real way to tell just by looking at a particular bramble plant. All righty. Well, thank you all again. Happy fruit growing. Bye, everybody.